So here we have a personification of astronomy, the muse of astronomy. And here we have her, she's complaining because when the RASC put her on the seal, not only did they have her not looking up, but there's no instruments representing what she does on that seal. No astronomical gear, no apparatus, no telescope, which is sort of strange. Anyways, there's some other interlocutors here who are referring to her as being grumpy. And so can they please hand her an instrument? And in a way, that's what this, you could say that we are giving Urania a bunch of telescopes to play with. So I'm going to start with an acknowledgement. The first acknowledgement is to the Sunshine Coast Center and Charles for inviting me. And I very much appreciate that. The other acknowledgement, two more acknowledgements. I have to thank Rudolf Dorner for coming up with the idea that the RASC should have a telescope museum and for funding it. Otherwise, it would be very hard to do if he didn't. The other people I have to thank is the board of advisors of the Dorner Telescope Museum. And these are experts in their field. There's Sarah Schechter at Harvard. There's Bart Fried, who's the founding president of the Antique Telescope Society. There's Roger Saragioli at the Stuart Muir Lab at the University of Arizona. And there's John Briggs at the Astronomical Lyceum in New Mexico. And their advice has been crucial in helping us realize this. And I very much appreciate that. What they've done for the museum, and this will come through as we proceed tonight. So, Dorner Telescope Museum. First question we could ask is, what's a telescope museum? It's a reasonable question. And here's a great big long definition of a museum taken from the Oxford English Dictionary, the big version of it, and of what a telescope is. Well, you all know what a telescope is. It's something with optics which allows you to see better than you can see with your naked eye. You can see deeper, you can see further into the universe or further back in time. The museum, the idea, the name itself goes back to Greco-Roman antiquity. It's a place, it's a center for study, a center for research, and some education, but it's also a place where, well, it has become a place where objects are gathered to be studied, to be looked at, to be enjoyed. Oh, and there's a muse of astronomy, Urania, from our seal, showing up again. Oh, it's very good of her. So how did this all happen? So Genesis in the beginning, and this is not the Genesis I mean, the biblical one, but this one. So spring of 2019, Rudolf Dorner, he's a longtime amateur with a love of visual observing. He found himself in a circumstance where his mind turned to possible legacy projects. Rudolf, he had an affinity for telescopes, or I should say he has an affinity for telescopes, because in 2019, when he was making arrangements, the original arrangements for this gift, he was advised by the doctors he didn't have long to live. When I met him, he had 2 weeks to live. So he wanted to do this in a hurry. Fortunately, he's still around. He's still playing with telescopes, I'm glad to say. So he had an affinity for telescopes, or let me rephrase that. He has an affinity for observing, and telescopes are integral. So telescopes and observing are integral to his well-being and happiness. And I can probably say that for everyone at this meeting tonight. So why not turn his joy in these portals to the universe into something more lasting to enrich others? To do this, he provided funds to the RASC to turn this aspiration into a reality. So the Dorner Telescope Museum for the RASC, it would be devoted to telling the story of the telescope in Canada from its origins in the 17th century up to the present. And this institution within the RASC would do this with the instruments, the makers, and the users. That's us and our predecessors. But this wasn't all. This museum would not starve its telescopes of starlight. This museum would find ways to dissolve the glass of the display cases whenever possible allowing viewers to be more than onlookers of sleeping artifacts in cases. And the DTM would find the lost stories of forgotten instruments, makers, and users. Personal anecdote. I received a call in early March of 2019 from the then executive director of the RASC. How would I like to plan a telescope museum? Since I didn't know any of this is happening, I said, sure. And I said, in the thought bubble, you could see the words, if you could read the thought bubble, as if that's ever going to happen. This is not going to happen. Next day, I receive another call. The donor wants to meet you, that is me. I said, get in the thought bubble. He does he? I wonder why. Donor. The one thing we should discuss tonight is address the question, are there other telescope museums or collections with significant relevant material? And of course, the answer is yes. Some of you may have visited them already, or at least visited them virtually on the net. And here's a list of some of them. There's a very impressive collection at the museum at the University of South Carolina, Robert B. Ariel collection. There's a collection, the Lohmann Museum of Historic Telescopes in Holland. There's the Galileo Museum in Florence. There's a museum of the observatory at the University of Bologna. There's the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, the collection of historic scientific instruments at the Putnam Gallery, Harvard University, Royal Observatory, Greenwich, History of Science Museum at Oxford, there's Whipple Museum at Cambridge. There's a Harkness Porter Museum of Amateur Telescope Making at Stellafane. There's a Museum of Astronomical Telescopes in Japan. There's the Astronomical Lyceum, which I've already mentioned, that's in Magdalena, New Mexico. And there's the Ingenium, which was formerly the Canada Science and Technology Museum, it's in Ottawa. These all have major holdings of telescopes. So that's a picture of one of the galleries and of the Robert B. Ariel Museum. That's the Lohmann collection, part of the Lohmann collection in Holland. That's in the Galileo Museum. Some of those are Herschelian in design, but they were made in the early 19th century. That's a picture of some of the display in the Astronomical Lyceum in New Mexico. That's one of the galleries in the Astronomical Museum in Japan. And that is a picture of a restored telescope. It's a 6-inch Cooke refractor. That's in the Ingenium in Ottawa. So there are other museums, either telescope museums or museums which have significant holdings of astronomical equipment. So the DTM is not alone. So the question has to be asked, what makes the RASC's Dorner Telescope Museum different? Well, for one thing, it's devoted solely to telling the story of the telescope in Canada. It's not a general science and technology collection with a subsidiary collection of telescopes, however notable they may be. Rather, the DTM's prime and only focus is a telescope and associated apparatus here in Canada. The DTM also aims at a different relationship between the artifacts and the museum goer. That is, as much as possible, try to dissolve that wall, which is the glass wall keeping the viewer from the telescopes. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's something we're going to try. So, what are the criteria for inclusion? And the slide answers the inquiry, will you take my uncle's junk scope? And other burning questions. So, the criteria. First of all, the collection will accept telescopes and accessories of Canadian manufacture. So they could be made by amateurs, professionals, or they could be commercial. Doesn't matter. There has to be a Canadian connection. 2, the collection will also willingly accept non-Canadian made instruments, which are representative of what Canadian amateurs used in the past and in the present, because these things form part of the story of the telescope in Canada. The Dorner Telescope Museum is naturally interested, and I should say very interested, in telescopes and or associated apparatus with which Canadians made significant discoveries or with which good science was accomplished, or which were used for notable observing events. Halley's Comet in 86, transit of Venus, a major full solar eclipse, doesn't matter. We'll also take instruments associated with culturally significant Canadians, and whether Canadian manufacturer or not, it doesn't matter. They have to have owned them or used them even. Fourth, the temporal span for inclusion is anything from the 17th century up to the present, or the future, if we can figure out how that works. And to me, it's crucial that these criteria have to be generously and flexibly applied, rather than applied in a restricted and limited way. And if you or anyone you know think that a telescope might be of interest to the collection, please don't hesitate to approach the museum. And in answer to the junk scope question, everything depends on the particular junk scope and the story which lies behind it. The stories are important for these things. They're what make the artifacts come alive. And I'm just going to present you with a few of the artifacts we have. Some of you are going to recognize this. So this is a copy of the Vittorio Croston's 1677 Galilean astronomical reliquary, which he made for the Medici at the time. This instrument, which is in the Galileo Museum in Florence, it's on display 3 artifacts associated with Galileo. 2 of the telescopes, the optical tube assemblies, which he made or had made for him. And in the center of that, what was originally, so in the original, it's actually a painted ivory and polychrome plaque in the center there, and you can see on the right, it's an objective lens from one of Galileo's telescopes, and the tradition is that's one of the telescopes he used for his epochal discoveries in 1609. So the rough surface of the moon, the satellites of Jupiter, the phases of Venus. That's from the telescope that made those discoveries. Oops, just go back here. So this is a copy by Réal Manceau. He's a Quebec-based amateur, and he's a very, very good technician. He decided he would copy this. And then we ended up acquiring it, and I'm very glad to have it. Réal even reproduced the cracks in the original lens. You can see that there. So this is an icon of astronomy. We're all old enough that we've seen pictures of this in the books we had as kids. Well, with an object like this, you can weave origin stories around. So one is the changes in time of interpretation and misinterpretation of this particular artifact. If you look at the early illustrations of this, and that's going up even into the 1960s, this instrument is reproduced, and people said, well, this is the arrangement Galileo had for observing. Well, if you look at this, there's no way you could use this for observing much. It'd be a real pain to turn this around to sight anything. You're limited in the angle, about 45-degree angle for observing things. It's worse than a transit telescope. Well, no, this arrangement was made for display. Long after, decades after Galileo died. But people interpreted it as how he mounted the instrument for use. So there's that misinterpretation. But there's also the interpretation of it when it was mounted like this in the 17th century. Galileo is being treated almost like a saint. These are relics of Galileo, the saint of science, which is interesting. Goes along with that finger that was also his bone that was also put on display in the reliquary, just like a church reliquary. Another story you can tell with this, about this icon of science, is a specific story of a modern amateur telescope maker, that's Réal Manceau, making this as a homage to a founding figure who was a predecessor of his as a telescope maker. And that's sort of cool. And there's your Canadian connection. Here's another one. Champlain's astrolabe, or Champlain's supposed astrolabe. Again, this is made by Réal Manceau. This shows you how good a craftsman Réal is. So, applying collecting criteria broadly for the museum means that this artifact can be included, even though it has no optical elements. It represents a naked eye instrument, or all the naked eye instruments, which preceded and coexisted with optical astronomical instruments. And if you look at this, the date of this thing, 1613, this dates from the same time Galileo used his telescopes. And it shows you that there's this overlap which continued for over 100 years of people using instruments for astronomy, sometimes quite serious astronomy, which had no optics. But Hevelius preferred non-optical means, and he achieved quite a good accuracy in positional astronomy. But this is a material icon of Canadian history as well as Canadian astronomy. And it's contested because, well, in at least two ways. It may not have belonged to Champlain at all. And as a tool for practical astronomy, which allowed Canada to be discovered, even though it would have been discovered by the native people who lived here, but discovered by Europeans in that scientific tradition, it meant they could map Canada. This tool of astronomy is also a tool of colonialism. And that brings with all types of difficult questions that we have to grapple with and are grappling with now. I really like this artifact. It's very heavy. And Riel did a very good job of reproducing it. Well, here we come to another icon. Again, you've all seen this in books. The original surviving reflector by Isaac Newton is actually made by Isaac Newton and his friend John Wickens, 1671, 1672. It's actually not Newton's first telescope, it's his third telescope. And again, this is by Riel. What I like is how Riel has actually hand-produced the metal elements for this, just like in late 17th century original instruments. So here we have another international icon with its own origin stories. But there's a Canadian element of this. Oops. And that Canadian element, Canadian amateur made it, and it's in the background. All of us have used Newtonian telescopes. We have this in the background of our mind when we face our much larger Dobsonians. This is the origin of that technology. So even though the original of this resides in the Royal Society in London, it's still also a shared artifact. It has an international importance, and it's almost like a UNESCO World Heritage artifact. It has that status. It's not just for science in London or England, or for the colonies, but it's beyond that. And and by virtue of that, it's also a Canadian artifact. Here's something else from the next century. It's from 1750. This is quite a large Gregorian reflector. It's got a 5-inch primary mirror. Well, this can be an entry point to a discussion of the instrumentation supplied in Europe for astronomical expeditions to North America, including those for the heroic ones. Well, at least they seem heroic to us in some ways. Heroic ones of 1761 and 1769 for the transit of Venus. And because of the name of the maker, Francis Watkins, this can lead to a consideration of trade and ownership of technologies. The whole dispute, and it was quite a vicious dispute in 18th century London, about who owned the patent for achromatic telescopes. Well, Watkins was involved with it. He's the man who put up the money for John Dolan to go into business making these instruments. And here's some more illustrations of it. Quite beautiful work. And the optics of this, the mechanics are beautiful. You can even see the maker's marks on these of the files. And the mechanics of the still work, they've got a buttery smooth motion. It's really quite astonishing. Here's a speculum mirror, which still reflects, which is sort of nice. Here's another one, the so-called Frederick Banting telescope. And yes, it's that Banting. There's a 6-inch f8 reflector. It's made sometime, probably early 19th century, first half of the 19th century. Could have been 1890s. So not all artifacts tell straightforward stories. And I could say perhaps none do. So Frederick Banting, 1891, 1941, Canada's first Nobel laureate, along with his arch rival, J.G.R. MacLeod. They're recognized internationally for the discovery of insulin. And I'm grateful they discovered it because I've been a diabetic for 46 years. Anyway, let's get back to this. This telescope is from the Banting homestead. It makes sense to us that, as a scientist, Banting would have had an interest in other areas of science outside his specialty. But there's no evidence that Banting had any interest in astronomy, nothing at all. There are other mysteries here. The instrument's beautifully made, but there's no maker's signature, and the mount is for a latitude well south of the Canadian border. So what's the status of this instrument? Is it another example of Champlain's astrolabe? You know, a triumph of hope over evidence? Is this a witness that Banting had an interest hitherto unrecognized in astronomy? Or did this belong to a member of his household? We don't know yet. But I'm glad it has this association anyways, and I'm glad we've got it. Here's another instrument. This is a Brasher Grating, and they're quite beautiful. The RASC used to own 2 of these, the rolling gratings produced by John Brasher. Then it didn't own any. At least one of these was a gift from Uncle John after he lectured in Toronto in 1899. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, to lose 1 grating may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose 2 looks like carelessness. Well, the RASC certainly was careless because it lost both of them, the early ones. Now, thanks to Bart Freed, one of the DTM advisors, we again have one of these gratings. And Uncle John Brasher was an honorary member of the RASC who took his membership seriously. These things are quite beautiful, the way they handle light. And it's this live thing. Depending on the angle you hold it, it shifts. The spectrum actually shifts, which is really quite neat. Coming to the present, Normand Fulham, one of the present great Canadian professional telescope makers, started out as an amateur. So through this artifact in the Dorner Telescope Museum, you can talk about an inventive amateur telescope maker who became an inventive professional telescope maker. Normand is still an amateur at heart. He does this stuff not to make a lot of money, because he loves doing it. And through Normand, these pictures were taken. So this is the instrument which we have in the museum, but this was taken with Normand, with the instrument at Stellafane. And this is entry into Canadian involvement in Stellafane. How early can we go? So in the course of a presentation to the Antique Telescope Society at the ATS in 2019 at the Sunspot Solar Observatory in the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico, I asked some basic questions about our knowledge, or lack of knowledge, of the history of the telescope in Canada. 3 of them were, when was the earliest astronomical use of a telescope? Where? Does the instrument actually survive? Well, I had forgot that ATS and RASC member Peter Broughton answered several of these questions in 1981, and I ought to have known better. So, based on Peter's work, the earliest known use of a telescope for astronomy in Canada was in 1646, the night of January the 30th to 31st, to observe a lunar eclipse. The place of observation was St. Marie among the Hurons in Ontario, and the observer was Father Francesco Giuseppe Bressani, who's a Jesuit. Unfortunately, the instrument doesn't appear to have survived. So, Bressani sent his observations to Father Athanasius Kircher, another Jesuit, who sent them to, and again, another Jesuit, got this chain of Jesuits, Father Giovanni Battista Riccioli, who printed them in his Almagestum Novum. And that was like the major astronomical textbook of the 1650s. Well, in that book, he noted that Father Bressani observed the eclipse very diligently. The observations also appeared in the posthumous collected works just a few years later of Father Pierre Gassendi, one of the great astronomers of the period, who refers to the excellent Bressani who observed with an exceptional telescope. What? That is, a mere 4 years after Galileo's death, a research quality telescope, that research quality for the time, was harvesting data, professionally respected data, in the middle, well, what would have been the middle of nowhere to the Europeans and Canada. It wasn't the middle of nowhere to the First Nations people. Certainly not. So that's viewed through a colonial lens. But still, that's pretty exciting, pretty amazing. Research quality telescope in Canada that early. Well, we need this telescope for the Dorner Telescope Museum, but it doesn't survive. In that case, what do? There is only one thing to do. You commission a full working reconstruction of an informed guess of the design the instrument may have had. It's the next best thing to having the original with full documentation tumble out of a cupboard, which had been sealed up for 375 years. So I tentatively asked Dr. Roger Siragioli, and he's another valued advisor for the Dorner Telescope Museum. I asked him about the optics. And in that phone call, or I guess it was an email discussion, Roger said he would donate the optics because he just made a similar set, 2 sets, the companion style optics with a Schreilian ocular. He made them for a colleague of his, Walter Stefani, who's an expert on Bernard Schmidt. So Walter gave his consent, but Walter just didn't consent to donate the optics. He offered to donate his expertise in making a mid-1650s optical tube assembly, mount and stand a la Johannes Hevelius, with help from his colleague, Dr. Arnie Payson. That is, Walter and Arnie would make this stuff. They wouldn't charge us for the labor. All they charge us for is for the materials. So we've got someone, so I should tell you a bit about Roger. Some of you may own equipment designed by Roger, though you don't know it. He's an outstanding optician. He's one of the lead people at the Stewart Observatory in Arizona who are making the optics for the giant Magellan telescope. So this is really cool. And Walter has experimented with making 17th century style optics using 17th century techniques. And same with Walter Stefani and Dr. Payson. So here's my drawing of Father Bressani with his telescope making epochal observations. The first observation we know of, astronomical observation with the telescope in Canada, 1646. Here's my reconstruction of it. That's St. Miriam on the Hurons. And here's the OTA that Walter Stefani has made using 17th century techniques, which is sort of cool. And Walter's tried a technique he's never tried before for doing the decoration. And I told him to go ahead. This is the cell for the eyepiece, and there's one of the elements of the eyepiece there. This turned out a hardwood, an antique lathe. This is the objective cell, again hardwood. This is the stand, and on the left there, you have the image from Johannes Hevelius' Linographia from about the same time. In the middle, you've got the blueprint, which Walter came up with Arnie, I think, for designing the reconstruction. And there's Dr. Arnie Payson. And our reconstruction for the Dorner Telescope Museum of the tripod, I guess it's a quadrupod, for this reconstruction of the first astronomical telescope we know of used in Canada. That's in the workshop in North Germany where it's being made. This is a full working reconstruction. It packs up. This means we can take this to star parties. This means, in theory, we could take this to the Sunshine Coast if we could work at the logistics. And so we can step back in time and observe the way people would have observed in the 1650s, which I find really a cool idea. Programs. So in programming, I want to cultivate a range of approaches from basic education all the way up to fundamental research using the equipment we've got. So a meaningful number of representative instruments, either authentic instruments or fully working reproductions, will not be protected behind glass, but they'll be on the floor to be touched and used to enable visitors to gain a more tactile experience of the equipment than is normal in museums. Instruments will also be available for experimental archaeology, the past styles of observing, and the collection will be consultable by telescope makers and researchers in the history of instrumentation. Another program will be a construction of a register of Canadian telescope makers, which doesn't exist as far as I know. There's no survey of historical telescope makers or present day ones in Canada. We'll use the means of oral history to recover and record local telescope making traditions and histories. And that would involve fieldwork to RASC centers, other clubs and institutions. finally, Rudolf came up with this brilliant idea that the museum named after him could actually go on tour before and after it officially opens. That is, one or two instruments from each of the centuries covered, the 17th and 21st century, would travel as a group with the director, the founder, and several other informed hench people to be part of a presentation on the DTM, which would show up at your centers or the star parties. And this would, as we set the instruments up, people would observe through them. Or if the weather wasn't cooperating, we'd have telescope petting zoos, whatever. So naturally, we'd only use robust originals or good facsimiles. This would provide a taste of the museum for people who couldn't come to Toronto or who weren't in Toronto to visit the museum yet. And it has the potential to smoke out other instruments or instrument makers or histories of these things in the areas we visit. So it's a great idea. Just got to figure out how to do it. And it's made doubly hard, of course, by trying to operate during a pandemic, which has affected so many things. So where are we now? We're at the stage of museum planning and design. These are a couple of my sketches, just figuring out how the hell we're going to do this. Just plans to set things up. I've also made models of the floor plan just to move things around, try things out. So where's this going to be? Well, this is a picture of the new national home of the RASC and the Dorner Telescope Museum. That's not what it looks like today. I wouldn't mind having one of those old cars. I think this is an image from 1920s. How old the building is. Go back there for a minute. This museum is being conceived and constructed as an asset for the society, and that means an asset to help centers deliver their programs better. And there's what it looks like today. They've added a story since that earlier photograph. We're on the second floor. And this is just a bit of a layout, showing roughly what the area the Telescope Museum is going to occupy. What I'm planning is for the displays to be easily movable, so that depending on what live events, which will be also broadcast, through Zoom or other platforms, but live events, we could actually have people in that space, and the museum could be easily adapted to host people. Or we could have shows or exhibitions of work by RASC members there. So it'd be a very flexible sort of museum space. Anyways, that's the end of the formal part of this. And I will stop share, which should return us to, there we go. So any questions or any ideas? I'd be glad to hear them.
Yeah, I've got an idea here. So I'm thinking about this idea that you were saying that you don't want the telescopes hidden behind glass. It's brought out so that people can use. And of course, indoors, there's nothing nearly far enough away to even focus a telescope on. But I'm thinking, I don't know the details, but there's sort of heads-up displays where they kind of project something and they make the focus at infinity. And I'm just wondering if there's any opportunity in the museum, for instance, to have, say, such a glass or something like that and project behind it something that's effectively at infinity, perhaps say an eclipse of the moon in, what was it, 1646 or whatever it was. Yeah. A sort of an actual kind of eclipse of the moon at infinity, and then people can get a telescope and have the actual trouble of aiming the thing and maybe finding out that it's upside down and actually observing what would have been observed by this Jesuit father, 300 years ago or whatever it was. But just to actually not only just be able to touch the thing, but actually to look through the thing and to struggle with aiming it and seeing what you can see. So anyway, that was just a thought. Does that technology exist, and could it be used in the museum?
It's an excellent idea, and it is a thought which has come up.
Okay.
And I think it would very much enhance the experience of anyone going there.
Yeah, no, to me,
I mean, there's lots of windows. We've got lots of big windows. So
yeah.
people can look out at the street.
Oh, okay,
Even then, I don't know, I might find a couple of raccoons and squirrels if I can afford the Nutella and have an arrangement with them where they could do stuff. No, your idea is a good one. And there's one thing, there's got to be a technology or several technologies that would allow us to do that.
Right. Anyway, it might just sort of, I don't know if they'll be able to put their hands on that oldest telescope in Canada, but it would be certainly fun for them to look through at a kind of a simulation of the eclipse and have to follow it along. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, that's my thought.
Yep. Well, it's good. Of course, when there will be eclipses, I do plan on taking that instrument or some others out to put them in the path of the eclipse where there are people.
Right.
If any of you think of any other ideas, you send them to Charles, you can send them to me, or you could find me on the RASC website, and I certainly welcome them.
Randall, you were mentioning that they are something that could be used as a resource for people who are trying to understand the technology. So would this be something that students of astronomy would want to look at to understand how these, or maybe ethno-astronomers or archaeoastronomy people would want to look at to better understand what they're doing in their research?
That's certainly one idea. There's people doing the history of science or history of instrumentation. Yes, definitely. Or if someone decides that ethnoastronomy or archaeoastronomy should include the European stuff, yes, is the answer. There's a tendency among, it's funny, most young astronomers, it's a funny thing, most young astronomers, I mean, they have to be concerned because of their careers with cutting edge research, which often means not paying much attention to the past. They get to a certain age, all of a sudden they become interested in the past. That's after they're established, of course, in their careers. There is a branch of modern astronomical research which wants to extend the time series. So if you're studying, let's see, if you're interested in transients, for instance, and you want to extend back your series of observations, because that's going to be valuable, then if you could use, the older you can go, the further back in time you can go, the further you can extend that, and you can perhaps pick up patterns and things, or look at the behavior. Unfortunately, the genre for reporting science, as you all know, changes with time. And the standards are not the same. So translating that stuff is difficult. But yeah, that is another, I mean, it's a milder version of that is using the old glass plates, right? And trying to digitize them, which Harvard is doing, and other places, some places in Europe. Elizabeth Griffin is outstanding, and she's in your province, outstanding person, pioneering some of that stuff. So yeah, if someone has data that was gathered with technology represented in the museum, and they're interested in how those instruments function to gather that data, absolutely, they've been invited to poke and prod what we've got.
Wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions? I'm really looking forward to going to the new place. I know that they're actually doing most of the moving into the new facility this week, in the middle of the week. So if anyone's trying to get a hold of them this week, it's going to be impossible because this is the big move week. But they have been gradually moving pieces of the exhibits in the museum over there for some time because they want to be very careful with this stuff. So I'm told by Jenna early today. But
what happened is I did all the packing. I decided that because of COVID, I'd just do it myself when no one else was around. And so I did that. It took longer than I expected, but Jenna and Renee and Phil actually carted a lot of the delicate stuff in their cars, which I certainly didn't expect them to do. I'm probably gonna, I'm often in there till 10 o'clock doing this packing because it's taking longer. I've got the archives packed, and I'm now doing delicate stuff. I still have to do the rare book collection.
Right, because I guess that's going to be part of the museum too, the old
Well,
records
no,
of
that's
society and so on.
no, that's not part of the museum. That's actually
Okay.
part of the archives.
Okay.
But it's got some stuff which the museum can use.
And I have another question, and that is actually my nephew was designed he designed some sort of a locking mechanism for a instrument on the Gemini telescope during a summer program up at the Astrophysical Observatory in Victoria. And so this was just a small component, but Canadians have been involved in making contributions. I mean, even to the James Webb, contribution of the mechanism that points it is, I believe, Canadian. And then there's some other technology. I'm not quite sure what it is. Is there any sort of aspiration of the Dorner Museum to showcase any of that kind of thing, sort of almost the kind of the component aspect of big modern astronomical projects?
Yes, in a word.
Okay.
Because it's got that Canadian connection. And I mean, this, what you told us is nice because he was doing a summer internship. So, and I assume at the time he was a student.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and that's really quite cool. And he may have gone, now his career will take him probably far from astronomy, but it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. There's another aspect which is worth telling. And even if it's a small thing, it's still part of what makes the science happen as a whole. So it is important. So yeah, tell those stories, absolutely. I'm trying to figure out, I mean, I was going to go back, I was probably, for the professional stuff, I was going to start with the Plaska telescope at the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. And I'm probably going to have to satisfy myself with probably doing a 3D printed model of it and some of the other things. Do that for the most satellite, Jamie Matthews and Peter Cervolo's project. It's a successful project. Again, had to 3D print something. But yeah, definitely. And if we could actually get an actual engineering prototype or even a plan, that'd be fantastic of any of these things. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I see that Charles has got his hand up.
Yeah, I just like the ancient instruments that are being shown. I suppose that the ancient skies that you have in your presentation were seen with precisely those instruments.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's talking about a presentation I recently did on ancient skies, and yes, quite a few of the things that you were told about there we're seen in using those kinds of instruments. I mean, now that I've done this asterism project, I'm much more familiar with the works of people like Hevelius that you were talking about in your presentation, and how they were creating constellations and recreating constellations.
Yes. Anytime you need something from a patron, you'd create a. That's
I'm going to make a constellation for this particular royal family because then they'll give me money for my telescope. So yeah.
Hey, why not? Yeah. The other thing about Hevelius, you probably talked about this. What happened to his observatory was a bit of Tycho Brahe's. These things, I mean, they look so substantial in the in the copperplate engravings, in the images. They look so substantial. They had massive equipment. I mean, the huge quadrants and so on. And yet, the trace of these things, the large focal length telescopes, 150 feet. You look at these places, and there's often nothing surviving, nothing on the site. Nothing that was there. And it just shows you how impermanent these things can be, even though I think of Arequipa, the disaster, the recent disaster there.
Mhm.
Just how easily something can be destroyed, no matter how culturally important it is. And it's not necessarily as a result of war. You know, just how fragile the things we build are.
I recall that at the General Assembly, I think it was in Calgary, I presented you with a map which had been drawn
Yes.
by a professor. Is that the sort of thing you're looking for as well?
Absolutely. That's nice. That was, so Charles gave me this. I don't know if there are any other examples surviving. It was part of the Canadian war effort. I think it was the early 40s, if I recall correctly.
42, I think it was.
Yeah.
Brian, was
And-
that something you gave me? I think you gave me this map and said to.
I did.
Oh, it was Danny. That's right. Yes,
Yeah, I
Danny.
got it
Mhm.
from the professor's wife,
Right.
and it was a handmade map from UBC.
Yeah, quite large and meant, of course, for celestial navigation,
Yes.
for people in the forces how to do this. And yeah, that sort of thing. That to me counts, right? It's Canadian. It's part of doing astronomy. You consider it a piece of associated gear. Because after all, to use it, of course, they may not have used optical aids. They just used their naked eye. Well, the fundamental piece of astronomical equipment we all rely upon is, of course, our eyes. So yeah, this counts. So anything like that, absolutely. And thank you for that, Daniel. It's great to have that thing.
My pleasure.
I couldn't believe it when Charles presented it.
I can still remember Danny's face because I don't think he believed it was worth that much until he saw your reaction to it. That was.
Oh God, yeah.
I've got a couple photocopies of it too, if anyone ever wants to see it.
Actually,
Here.
no. Gee, interesting.
But
haven't
you've
thought
got
of-
the original.
Yeah. I mean, we could actually produce some decent originals too. That's a good idea. But it shows you something like that, which is meant for use. If they actually get used, it's amazing how few of those things survive. Another problem was, same period, so Second World War, Frank Hogg, who at one time was director of the David Dunlop Observatory, is Helen Hogg's husband. He designed a bubble sextant for doing navigation in an aircraft. And I think one of the prototypes went to the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain during the war. It got some notice, but they decided not to produce it. So I think there's only 5 of these in existence, or maybe even less. But again, just how tenuous some of these artifacts are, and it wouldn't take much for them to disappear. So yeah, thanks, Dan.
I have several, maybe 3 questions about the presentation.
Okay.
One is that in maybe 1961, I guess, I was given a very short-sighted telescope when I was a high school student. My high school was getting rid of stuff, and I guess, I don't know, I guess I was a brown noser and got this short-sighted. I have this very short-sighted telescope, which I'm willing, if it qualifies, to
Brian,
contribute.
is there a maker's mark on it, Brian?
Yes, it's called the Spencer
New York. Yep.
Spencer Lens,
Yep.
Buffalo, New York.
Yep.
So if you're interested, it's yours.
That's very good of you.
Next question is, have you canvassed the various astronomy clubs in Canada? We're a young astronomy club, so we hardly have any archives or museums or history. But for example, in the 80s, when I was a director at the Vancouver Planetarium, I did a couple of things just as examples. One, I donated a telescope, a homemade telescope, a telescope that I had made and stood and ground the lens, the mirror for in 1957. And then it was a saga, and there's a story goes with it. If you're interested in stories, there's a story that goes with it that culminates in not until 1969 did it have its first light,
Good heavens.
where I saw the Jupiter and its moons and realized that no, it's not a QAnon conspiracy theory, or yes, there were people on the moon, and yes, it's really true that these things are out there, because I had seen it with my own eyes through the thing I had built ground up. I ended up contributing this to the astronomy club at in Vancouver for use in their loaner program and so on. But it was a heavy great thing, and the pier on it was cut at 43 degrees. Wasn't adjustable. It was 43 degrees, which is the latitude of London, Ontario. And so there it is. I have no idea what has happened to it, but it's an old, heavy, clunky thing that has a story. And so the point is, A, it's there maybe, and B, have you canvassed the various centers in Canada recruiting stuff that has gone and is going unappreciated wherever it is? The second item that was contributed to the Vancouver Planetarium and Museum back in those 1980 days was an apparatus that was used back in the time when we were trying to figure out whether there was water on the moon. And this was an apparatus that was used by a graduate student from U of T, a childhood neighbor of mine, who was researching that. And this apparatus got recruited from wherever it was, I forget, and was at the Vancouver Planetarium and Museum in their area. But I have no idea what has happened to it in the last decade or two. My point in general is, has your museum canvassed these areas, canvass these centers and organizations to see whether are there things that are languishing languishing there unappreciated that could be recruited. So that's my second point.
I'll deal with point 2 first. That is an excellent idea. I have not done that systematically. I have done that. We have received some things from some centers, which I'm very, very glad to have. One from the London Center, actually, a telescope made in the 20s or 30s, quite massive. The other thing, your first point. So yes, what you suggested is an excellent idea, and it should be done in more than one medium. When I do that, that's an excellent idea. The other thing, oh yes. So your first point, I'd be delighted to have that microscope. And do you want to guess why?
Sure, I'm yes, indeed.
I mean, I like your story about it, and see, it did pay to be a brown-nosing kid back then. The reason I want it, and I should have realized this earlier, is there's this real connection between telescope collectors. This is in the past. I don't know about now. In the past, so when I say the past, I mean Charles Messier's time and into the 19th century. A lot of people who were amateur astronomers were also amateur naturalists. Like people who used microscopes and collected them. I discovered the auction catalog for Charles Messier after he died. He had as many telescopes as he had microscopes, which is really interesting. The guy who beat Charles Messier out in the recovery of Halley's Comet, 1759, I think it was or late 1758, maybe 1759, was one of these people who is referred to now as a peasant astronomer or a farmer astronomer, which is not really a good description. You had characters like this in Low Countries and in Germany in the 18th century, who were really scientifically quite sophisticated people, but their daytime occupation was as farmers or managers of farms. Anyways, his name was Pallich. He had as many telescopes as he had microscopes. So yeah, that has to have held in Canada as well. You've provided me the means. Now I'm guessing that microscope dates anywhere from 1890 to probably, I doubt that it's as late as 1950. I really doubt it. It would be earlier than that. But that, if we had that on display, I can make that point about telescopes and microscopes and the people with the dual interests.
British botanist and philosopher John Hill, because in 1754, he created a whole series of asterisms.
Oh my God, yes, him.
Yes, in his book, Urania, or A Complete View of the Heavens. And so he certainly had microscopes too, because he was putting all kinds
perfect
of
example
up there, yeah.
Boy, he had a funny career, didn't he? Yeah, I'd
did.
forgotten about him. Yes, an excellent example, Charles, excellent example.
Well, I'll give this microscope to,
That is, Brian, if you're done with it.
Oh,
I wouldn't want to deprive
no,
you.
it's collecting dust at the top of my bookshelf.
Well, thank you again, Randall, for taking the time to join us. This really was an interesting presentation. I'm really looking forward to seeing it when it's finally all set up.
Yeah, well,
at the new place. And
yeah, it's going to take some time.
Yes, it surely is, but we're all looking forward to it.
So mind you, the events sponsored by the museum can happen before it's actually formally set up.
Right. Well, keep us posted. We're all very interested.
Anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity to present it.